What's up, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of our series where we tackle the question of whether or not we can trust the Bible. If you didn't see the first video in this series where we deal with the question of manuscripts for the Bible, I'd recommend you go watch that so you can get caught up. In this video, we are going to stick with the New Testament and look at the authors. In the first video, we showed that for the New Testament, we have plenty of manuscripts to reconstruct the original writings. But what if we can't trust the original writings? How do we know we can trust the person telling the story? And the example often used by critics is that we also don't believe people were abducted by aliens. We've all seen videos of people claiming to have been abducted by aliens. Sometimes there's multiple people abducted and they can all corroborate each other's stories, but no one believes them even though they swear it's true. So the question is asked, if we don't trust them, why should we trust the apostles? It's a fair question, and one that former atheist and investigative journalist Lee Strobel also asked. In his book, The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel takes the reader through 8 tests of accuracy when evaluating eyewitness testimony. These are the same tests that attorneys use in court when evaluating an eyewitness. The first test is the intention test, and it asks whether or not the testimony was intended to be historical fact. You start with this test because if the answer is no, then there's no need to move forward. For example, if we were to apply this test to a publication like The Onion, we wouldn't need to move forward because we know it's not meant to be true. So we have to ask the question, did the authors of the New Testament intend to have their writings taken as historical eyewitness accounts? First, let's look at the Gospel of John. If you read chapter 20, you're going to come across a section titled, The Purpose of This Book. In that section, we read that John wanted to showcase the life of Jesus so that others may believe. Or we can look at the Gospel of Luke in the intro that he wrote for Theophilus. In those first few verses, Luke explains that he was interviewing eyewitnesses so that he could write an orderly account and be certain of what took place. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark do not have any statements of intent, but I think you'll agree that in reading through them and comparing them to the Gospels of John and Luke, there's really no indication that they were written with any other intent other than to be a historical account. The second test is the ability test, where we ask if the supposed eyewitnesses are even capable of producing accurate testimony. Recording history is all fine and dandy, but if you weren't even there to begin with, why should we trust your eyewitness account? It would be like me telling you I'm going to write my eyewitness account of the Super Bowl, even though you know I've never been to the Super Bowl, I don't watch the Super Bowl, I could barely tell you whoever played in the Super Bowl. So we have to apply that same test to the apostles. Matthew and John were both disciples of Jesus, so it makes sense that they would be able to produce a historical account. Mark was one of Peter's associates, who was also a disciple of Jesus. Peter would give his reports of Jesus to Mark, who then wrote them in his gospel. Luke was a travel companion of the Apostle Paul, and he also interviewed eyewitnesses for his gospel. Test number 3 is called the character test. Pretty self-explanatory. In this test, you examine the character of the witness. You ask whether they had any negative or manipulative intentions, were they lying and twisting the story for their benefit. We see this all the time in the news. A story will come out with pretty clear-cut facts, and then different sides will try to persuade the viewer to their way of thinking. So we have to look at the authors of the New Testament in the same way. For this test, I turn to J. Warner Wallace, the author of Cold Case Christianity. Wallace is a cold case homicide detective and an atheist turned Christian. During criminal investigations, Wallace notes that motive always boils down to these 3 things: the pursuit of money, sex, or power. In looking at the lives of the apostles, it doesn't take much to realize that none of them benefited from any of these motives. Matthew was a tax collector, and these were notoriously wealthy individuals, and yet he left that life to become a disciple. The motivation of sex is also pretty easily dispelled. Whenever their letters address sexuality, all of the apostles advocate for sexual purity. So if they were motivated by sex, they certainly went about it in a weird way. And lastly, with the motivation of power, all you have to do is look at Paul. Before becoming an apostle, Paul was already in a position of power in the Jewish religion. And yet when he encountered Jesus, he left that position of power. If you're really pursuing power, you would think that you would go down a path that doesn't lead to being skinned alive or beheaded or crucified like some of the apostles were. Test number 4 is the consistency test. For this test, we compare their stories and see if they line up on certain details. If you ever watch cop TV shows, or if you ever had run-ins with the cops, you'll notice that whenever they take eyewitness testimony, they always separate the witnesses. They do that to see if the stories line up without the witnesses influencing each other. This is probably the most contested point in the New Testament. There are definitely variances in how each writer tells their story. But in looking at these, a lot of them can be explained away pretty easily. I'm going to make a video where we go in-depth into a lot of the variances, but I wanted to at least cover one so you can see how they can be explained away. In Luke 6, we are told that the Sermon on the Mount was given on a level or flat place. But in Matthew 5, we're told that it took place on a mountain. See, their stories don't match up. Well, kind of. The word mountain in Matthew was commonly used to refer to hill country. In Luke's version, level or flat place could also refer to a plateau in a mountainous region. So we need to be careful not to say that every difference means a contradiction. If the Gospels were all the same, we would hear the argument on the flip side complaining that all the Gospels are too similar and the apostles must have been copying each other's letters. The story details should be mostly the same so that they pass this test, but not so similar that we just assume they were cheating off of each other's papers. The fifth test is called the bias test. To have full disclosure, of course the authors were biased for Jesus, but the test doesn't ask whether or not you're biased. It asks whether or not your bias would motivate you to falsify your account. Which brings us to test number 6, the cover-up test. When we lie or falsify information, we usually do so to protect ourselves, hide embarrassing information, or gloss over hard-to-understand circumstances. If the authors were biased to the point of a cover-up, they certainly left a lot of embarrassing or shameful information in the Gospels. We have stories detailing the disciples' lack of understanding for parables, bickering over which of them was the best disciple. Jesus literally called Peter Satan, and Peter's lack of faith literally almost had him drown right in front of Jesus. There's a story that is easily fixed if you were biased. Peter walks on water and doesn't embarrass himself is a much better headline than disciple can't even have faith with Son of God right in front of him. Also, one of the disciples betrayed them. That's a hugely embarrassing detail. Based on these and many other shameful and embarrassing details in the New Testament, we can conclude that the apostles were not part of some massive cover-up conspiracy. Test number 7 is the corroboration test. For this test, you look into outside sources to confirm eyewitness testimony. The short answer is the more archaeologists dig, the more evidence we find to support the writings of the New Testament. But I'd like to touch on 2 objections that have been solved thanks to archaeology and outside sources. For the longest time, there was no historical evidence for the existence of Pontius Pilate. But then in the 1960s, an archaeologist came across a stone tablet with Pilate's name and job title carved into it and dated it to around 30 AD, just like the Bible said. The funny thing about this discovery is that this stone fragment was likely originally used in a temple, but was then pulled in the 4th century and used in a set of stairs, and that's where the archaeologists found it. The second discovery is a skeleton also found in the 60s. One criticism of the Gospels is that there was no historical evidence that people were crucified with nails. So critics said, nails weren't used, the Bible says there were nails, therefore the Bible is false, Jesus wasn't crucified with nails. But then an archaeologist discovered a burial site of about 35 bodies. In that burial site, they came across the bones of someone who had been crucified. And when they pulled the heel bone out, they found a 7-inch nail still lodged in a knot in the bone. It looks like when the person was taken down from the cross, they couldn't pull the nail out of the bone because of the knot, so they just left it in. And this skeleton is dated to about 2,000 years ago. It's gruesome, but it gives historical evidence to the method of crucifixion with nails. The 8th and final test is known as the adverse witness test. Basically, you go to the critics of the eyewitnesses and see what they have to say. In his research, Strobel notes that critics of Jesus at the time would often refer to him as a sorcerer. Why not just say he never existed, or he didn't turn water into wine, or he didn't heal people from sickness, or he didn't cast out demons? If the biggest critics of Jesus at the time needed to refer to him as a sorcerer, there's reason to believe that something supernatural happened. So those are the 8 tests for accuracy when evaluating eyewitnesses. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. I hope you'll stick with me as we continue to walk through this question of whether or not we can trust the Bible. Next week, we're going to circle back and look at some of the objections raised for the Old Testament. We spent a lot of time in the New Testament, and I want to make sure we look at the Old Testament in the same way. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next week.